Welcome back. Jake Simons here once again with another edition of our special coaches interviews videos. We have 9 episodes in this video series interviewing expert coaches from across the state. We actually have Adam Gray, Michael Schlagenhoff, Jamie Taylor, Katie Guess, Kate Lubers, Ryan Mitchell, and Jennifer Gray, all sharing different tips on different topics. Today, we're going to ask them how they structure a normal practice, if there is such a thing. Enjoy. So what does a normal practice look like for your team then?
We don't have normal practices.
Is there such thing?
Uh, yeah. Yep. So it really depends on who's here because, again, with the flexibility that we provide, not everybody's here for every practice because maybe on a Tuesday, 3 of the kids can come, and on Thursday, uh, one of those kids can come, but 3 of the other kids can come. So it really depends on who's here. Generally, practices are set up at the beginning of the year to divide out tasks among the kids, specifically building out prototypes. So, like for right now, we're in prototype and design stage. So, depending on who's here and what their interests are and the types of things that they would like to build and test, they will pair up, 2 kids, 3 kids, or whatever, and they'll work on something together. So, right now, my basement has, I don't know, half a dozen at least prototypes of just random stuff all over the place, and a couple half-built robots, one completely built robot, and a hero bot that's currently being scavenged for parts. So, at the beginning of the season, that's what that looks like, and then as we start to get into the actual like build season, where we're ready to start building what our competitive robots are going to be, things will solidify a little bit more into the design. All of that design work gets translated into the notebook, into different design drawings. And then like drive base will be assigned out to somebody, or somebody will take it. I don't actually assign anything personally. I may offer suggestions, but for the most part, the kids run the practices. So um, somebody will do that. Somebody will do whatever manipulator mechanism that they choose. So for this year, if it's, a flywheel or a catapult or a ramp or whatever, like somebody will take charge of, building out that based on the prototypes that we built and tested earlier. So then once we get the robot built, it'll kind of split into 2 kind of separate parts, maybe even 3. So it depends on who's here, because some of the kids are really interested in the programming and some are not interested whatsoever. Some kids love driving and they live to drive, and some kids never want to be on a stage ever in their life. And some kids, they don't care about anything but the building. So the ones that want to build, like, okay, cool, we got a robot done. Start building the next robot. So we'll basically do a leapfrog system with build one robot and then build the next robot. Then we can start to tear down the first robot once the second robot replacement is ready enough and good enough. We have at times built duplicate robots at the same time so that drivers and programmers can have the robot together. So it just depends on who's here at the time. So the programmer will be doing all the programming for the controller and for autonomous, and then the drivers will run practice matches. So that's kind of the overall gist of how it all works. But like when all that stuff happens is very, very fluid.
Well, that's kind of the hard thing, right? Because as a planner, myself, like I want to plan out an entire season's worth of practices. So we're doing this on this date and this on this date, and it never works out. Like you usually get the first maybe 2 or 3 practices to fit that mold. And then from there, it just has to be
Yep.
the organic practices. Like whatever we
Yep.
need to work on, we're working on. I like how you touched on the leapfrog strategy. That's something that you taught me years ago too, something that we did. If you can afford the extra parts, definitely a strategy that should be utilized by all teams, I would think. Just keeps your kids on task, and that's really the most important thing when it comes to these practices is finding tasks for everybody to be working on, because
Uh,
otherwise
uh,
it becomes a management issue. So,
Yeah. And I suppose I should say that I try to have about 3 practices a week
okay,
available.
sure.
Kids won't necessarily be at all 3 practices, just because of the aforementioned flexibility, but they won't always be the same days necessarily because, I've got kids that are doing things too. But my goal is to have 3 practices a week, roughly about 2 hours a piece. Sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, based on need. If a kid needs to leave early or come late, that's fine too. So,
Or, you have a competition coming up, you add another practice in there. That's the
yep,
thing is
yep,
time is your biggest advantage in robotics. And, a lot of coaches, say we have one practice a week for 45 minutes, and then they wonder, why they aren't being able to compete with some of the better teams across the state. And it's probably
yep.
because you haven't put enough time into it. So
The time adds up.
time adds up for sure.
Yeah, so for the elementary kids in particular, 2 days a week. Usually we do it in the mornings before school, so they start at 8. We will start the practices at 7 a.m., which is always fun to get the kids in the door that early, but thankfully they've got lots of energy. And we get right to it. In the mornings, or in the early part of the season, it tends to be focused on, let's get a robot built. Are we going to use a base from last year and knock the robot down to just that base and build up? Do we try the hero bot? Do we do this? Some early rules reviews before we get into that, some brainstorming, you know, prototype if there's questions, if they need to pros and cons something. But then it very quickly turns to all hands on deck, get that first robot built.
Mhm.
Once that happens, then it moves into, okay, what were the ideas that you don't think you had time to do now? And some kids start building that or prototyping something while the rest of them are, practicing driving, or they're doing programming. Sometimes we've had a team build a second copy of that same robot so they can do things in parallel. And that's pretty much how it goes for them. Sometimes we get closer to competition, especially February timeframe. Wednesdays start slipping in there in the mornings, or a Wednesday afternoon. Every once in a while, a Saturday will pop up, and if we've got a team that's like really close and they're really gung ho, I work with the teacher that's the main coach to we get them in there, and we give them that time as we can.
Yeah. I want to touch on something that you actually hit on a little bit ago, and that is building a second robot almost identical to the first robot. That's something that we've called the leapfrog strategy in the past. And it's an incredibly helpful strategy for a couple reasons. One, it keeps all of your kids engaged because now you have multiple kids building. But also, the biggest issue that we were finding several years ago was that, once you have a robot that's built, you only have one robot. You have kids that need to drive it. You have kids that need to program it. And then what about the kids who want to modify it and make it better? And so what we started doing was just having literally two build and design teams building the exact same robot, sitting right next to each other, copying each other, building the same thing. Once one robot is done, drivers can go drive that. And then this other robot kind of leapfrogs it, and you can continue to modify, make it better. And once that one is better, that one can be driven. This robot can then be modified or changed or programmed or whatever. So there's always something for the kids to be working on. So if you have access to more parts, money for more parts, definitely take advantage of that. One kit is enough generally to build one pretty simple robot, but if you can invest in a lot more parts, definitely do that, because that, leapfrog strategy or whatever you were referring to as well is a great strategy to keep kids on task and to continue to go through that engineer design process.
So I kind of follow the same structure for the IQ kids and the high school kids. High school is a little bit different because usually once they get to high school, they know if they're going to do it or not do it.
Right.
My high school team's way smaller than IQ teams. First practice is the most boring practice they will ever have. I read through the manual. I put it up on a screen so they can see it. I print some out so they can follow along. And we literally read through the manual, highlight the game, the major rules of the game. We watch the game reveal video. We kind of talk a little bit of strategy once we get through the manual, talk about, the sizing, the motors, etc., because it's super important for them to understand the rules. And it's one of the questions they get asked, have you read the rules? So they can all honestly say when they get questions at inspection or whatever, have they read the rules? They did, because they were there for the first practice where we read through them. How much of it they retain is up to them, but we can honestly say that we've read through the rules. And I try to make sure that when the new versions come out, every time at the start of practice, we'll be like, hey, new rules came out. These are what's the changes that made. Once we get past that first practice, then practices are kind of a mad rush for the first 8 weeks because we host one of the very first competitions of the season here at Caston. Like this year, we are October 26th. So my teams get a minimum of 8 practices in before they have their first competition. So they get 8 2-hour sessions to get a robot built and functioning to be able to compete with it. So first practice is break them up into their teams, have them come up with at least 3 different design ideas, whether it's building a hero bot and following the instructions of that one, or if they're going to come up with something totally on their own, they need to have some sketches down so I can see what kind of idea they've got going. And then once they get started building, then I kind of pull out the documenters, get them started on the engineering notebook with, I always start them off with first introduce your team, list who you've got, how many years they've experienced, etc. And then they start in on their game analysis of, all the rules of the game and the scoring structures and whatever. And then I set the documenters aside. I put them at, like, for elementary, we've got 2 teams. For junior high, we got 3. I set the documenters aside at a table by themselves so that they can help each other if they have questions on how something works or what's a rule or where'd you find this kind of thing, because they're doing it individually, but they're still doing the same thing. And if they're over at their table with their team, they're getting distracted and they're not getting it done. And then the teams themselves, they are pretty much set free to get their robots started building. Yeah. Once we got this season, for example, once we've gotten a couple weeks in, then I had some kids that really, really, really wanted to work on programming, and you can't program yet because you don't have a robot. So I sat them down with computers and had them work through all the tutorials on the VEX code. And then the following week, I set them up on the VEX code VR so they could actually do some practice programming and running it with the virtual robots so they could get experience doing that, because they weren't wanting to build, but they weren't being productive otherwise. So I needed to give them something to do. So that kept them working on the structure that they wanted to do. So we essentially had like 3 groups of things going on during practice, but it helped to keep kids busy. And that left this year, all of my teams have 5 kids on them, which is big for Caston. Normally I stuck with 3 or 4 kids, but with the way the game's set up this year, 3 kids and one gets sick, then they don't have a match loader. So it was a matter of, let's make some bigger teams and see how this works. I'll find out if it works. I might have to change it.
I was going to say, there's 2 kind of major themes here that I think you're hitting on. The first major theme is always having something for every kid to do, right? It's a management thing, because as educators, there may be a lot of educators watching this, and we all know that when you don't have tasks for kids to be working on, it can turn into chaos very, very quickly. And then the second theme that I hear you saying is you kind of have this overarching plan of what you want to accomplish this month, maybe this season, following the engineer design process, but you don't really have a set schedule and plan. And as educators, that's hard because many of us are planners. And I remember my first couple seasons, I tried to like literally plan out an entire season's worth of practices on, on January 8th, we're going to be doing this. On February 7th, we're going to be doing this. And after about 2 practices in October, those plans are all the way out the window because it just becomes an organic thing there, right? Like whether we're building, we're designing, we're going over the rules, we're strategizing, we're programming. One of those things or a couple of those things are always happening, but we don't know when.
So from this point so far, like you said, the beginning of the season is really a lot of us like setting up our engineering notebooks for the season, going through the game manual. We even looked at some of like the drive team course questions and things like that have been released by the REC. So that was helpful for our students this year as well. But now we're kind of getting into our standard, just everyday practice. So we'll start by coming together and we'll share any updates with the students or just things that like as a group, I feel like we could use some additional instruction on. So things I notice that the students are struggling with, or they could help, or we can help them with just, some videos or things that they can look at. So one thing we talked about recently was just getting like speed versus torque with your gears and things like that. So it was an example of what we did last week. But then after that point, our kids are really all at different points. So they're building their robot. When they're ready to start testing things, they can go to the field and do that. They can be working on their coding. We do encourage them to make sure they're keeping up with those engineering notebooks. From time to time, the coaches will pull those and then provide feedback to the students like, hey, you really are missing a lot of these things. Make sure you're adding these as we go forward. So it's really kind of like organized chaos where a lot of the students are at different parts of the engineering design process. And we're just kind of checking in with them throughout the practice to give them the support that they need.
So one of the biggest things for me that I learned early on in practices is as much as we can to make it student led. I think it's so easy as an adult and as a leader to insert ourselves too much into it. But really trying to figure out, okay, how can the kids lead? So from the moment we start, we have the kids writing the agenda on the board and we'll go through and here's the agenda for the day. Now we help with the agenda, but even just as simple as them writing it on the board, they're starting to own it. At all of the different parts of the team, we have our documentation team, our builders, and our drivers, really depending on what we're focusing on. But when we start the meeting, we all start kind of working on, because everybody, usually they arrive a little bit, and some arrive a little bit on time or a little early, and some arrive a little bit later. And we found out early on that we wanted to make sure we didn't start officially until everybody was there, because then I always felt like someone got left out or left behind. And so for that first little bit, usually it's just pulling things out. So everybody has their jobs, pulling out all the parts, pulling out what they're working on, pulling up and getting started on the documentation. So, and then we all start once everybody's there. We go through what are the goals for the day? What is it that they're hoping to accomplish? What is everybody's role for the day? So everybody knows what they need to be focusing on, which is then easy to hold the kids accountable. So if they get off task or off focus, then we can go back to, okay, where are we at with our goal? Or where are we at with this? Your goal today was to be driving, but you want to be building. And, so being able to help them kind of navigate towards and really own what they're doing. Once they go through, closer to the end, we always have a cleanup time because that's the one thing the kids hate doing. But if you build it into it, then they get used to it. One thing I started implementing is just like a goofy song. When we play the song, they know, oh, it's cleanup time. And then that just became part of the routine. So then I know, okay, it's time to close down, pick up what I'm doing and put it away. So that way we make sure we keep our space clean. And then after the cleaning time, we debrief. Now, we don't do it perfect every time. Sometimes we run a little bit later. We're just so close to getting something. And then they're finishing up and walking out the door and I will clean up. But really just being able to evaluate where their biggest needs are and seeing how we can help them get there.
Yeah, I like how you touched on just making sure that it's student focused, student centered. Having that ownership is key. I think one of the REC Foundation's common phrases is student centered, adult organized, and I think the trap that many people fall into is doing one or doing the other, and only, right? Only student centered, only adult organized. And you have to have that balance where the students have that ownership. They are the ones that are dictating how the practice goes, but the adults are there to organize kind of this overarching season and timeline.
And I think one of the biggest challenges for a coach, when I signed on, I did not know much about robotics. Like it was all brand new to me. And I think there's that pressure of I have to know everything so I can help my kids. And so the reality is when you have that mindset, you're more likely to be that domineering force of, I have to know, I have to be able to tell them, I have to be able to lead it and being able to go down that way. But if you're truly kid focused, if you don't know, there's so many things kids come up to me and they're like, I have this problem. We don't know what to do with it. We're like, okay, well, let's figure it out together. And then you start by asking questions. And I think that's a big thing of if you really want something to be student led, it's by getting the students to come to that conclusion through a directive. Like we're helping them to arrive at that conclusion. And the reality is most of the time, I don't even know the answer. We're going to figure it together, right? And that really truly gives the onus on the kids to feel comfortable in that space too, of like, let's figure this out. And we're going to figure it out together. So I think that's the biggest thing when you're running practices, when coaches are running practices, to make sure that it's not so rigid. to let the kids, give the kids space to be able to lead. And then you also find which ones are your natural leaders.
Yeah.
So we got to points, I mean, when you practice so often and you're getting down to the nitty and gritty, and sometimes, you know, it gets a little bit much and you have kids that are goofing off or you have kids that are not focused, you start to notice the kids that are your natural born leaders that will step up and say, hey guys, we've got a goal. We got to work on this. Hey, we're not messing around right now. Let's focus on this. Instead of an adult pointing those things out, the kids take over that space.
Yeah.
Yeah, we always start practice with kind of a summary of where we ended. You know, we have the engineering notebook where they are supposed to say, you know, what they're going to work on at the next practice. It doesn't always get documented. So we always want to kind of say, hey, this is where we ended. This is what we were going to work on today. Make sure everybody knows what their role is for the day. Sometimes, like early in the season, it's who's going to build, who's going to get the parts. If you're not one of those groups, what are you going to do to help kind of get the ball rolling? Once the season gets going, we do a lot of figuring out who's going to be the drivers, do a lot of partnership work to see who works best with who, because again, similar to if you want to be on the team, you get to be on the team. I'm one of the people that says if you want to drive, you get to drive. And you know, that might just be doing the skills competition where you're not, you know, front and center with everybody on the big stage. But I let every student that wants to drive at least drive once per competition. So practice.
Yeah. So you're, you know, I'm interviewing a lot of different coaches and getting all the different approaches that these coaches have within their teams. And so you would say that you're on the end of the spectrum of allowing every kid to kind of test out all the different areas if they're interested in those areas. Can you talk about that a little bit and explain why you go that route instead of having specific kids and specific roles?
Yeah, so I learned kind of early on that loud personalities kind of get what they want when it comes to you know, letting kids make decisions. And I saw that there were a lot of I don't want to say a lot of, I had students that didn't do what they wanted because they didn't feel like they had a voice to say, I want to try it.
Sure.
And so from then on, I really just said, like, if you want to give it a go, let's give it a go. There's a lot of times where a kid tries something and they realize themselves, like, this isn't me, right? They know. And then sometimes there's peer pressure where, like, you know, if a team's doing well, they'll say, hey, I know that they're a better driver, let them drive this time. And they'll, you know, kind of take that on themselves. But yeah, I'm just all for letting kids try things out, because, you know, if they don't give it a try, they might not realize that it's a strength, and they might also not realize it's something that they weren't as good as they thought they did.
Yeah.
First, we start off with snacks. That is a big thing about practice, and those are all donated. And then I highly recommend, if you can, having a parent with every team. That is super important and helps your practices run so much smoothly. Even sending out individual emails, going to their car at dismissal, telling them how important it is for their team to have a parent. We start out, especially at the beginning of the year, I'll make a robotics Google Classroom and post research videos in there, different links that TechPoint has provided for us, and like the game video, the game manual. We start out really researching that game manual. And then during build season, they start out going through the engineering design process. And then usually there's two builders, a specific notebook person. Right now, someone is on the VEX driver course too, so they learn all the rules of the game. My teams have about 4 team members for each team. And then competition season changes a little bit with scrimmages and practices. And then wrapping up at the end of practice with making sure our notebook is complete.